welcome to Enigma Traitors with Dermot Turing. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education here at the International Spy Museum. Thank you so much for joining us. Tonight, Sir Dermot Turing will discuss his latest book, Enigma Traitors, The Struggle to Lose the Cipher War. Dermot is an honorary board member here at the Spy Museum, and he has been a great friend of the museum. He is a former trustee of the Bletchley Park Trust, where his uncle, Alan Turing, famously worked during World War II. Dermot wrote Alan Turing Decoded, The Man Called Prof, about his uncle, and the award-winning book XYZ, The Real Story of How Enigma Was Broken. He also wrote a pamphlet about the bomb that is entirely readable. And I really have to, I thank you for that, Dermot. Dermot's going to give a fantastic presentation. I'm getting out of here because we got a presentation.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Amanda. It's always a pleasure to be here at SPY in Washington, D.C. They just didn't tell me what clothes to wear, but never mind. I come from Scotland, and it's not really quite like you have it this month here. But anyway, there we are. I will somehow cope. If I fall over in a dead faint, just come and splash cold water over me. Okay, right, this presentation is called A Close Run Thing, and there's a question for the audience as to who I am misquoting with that particular phrase. You have to cast your mind back over 200 years. Okay, this is the story we think we know about code breaking in World War II, particularly with reference to the British achievement at Bletchley Park. We know that Benedict Cumberbatch single-handedly broke the... Oh, have I made a mistake there? That single-handedly broke the famous German Enigma cipher. He did it in some shed somewhere, and by a miraculous process, then the German Enigma messages were able to be read, and so we won the war in Europe. And as it's not quite, next week it will be, but it's not quite 80 years from VE Day, then we have Alan Turing to thank for that. So we can all go home and sleep quietly in our beds. That is the narrative you have been brought up with, and I'm sure you all believe all of it. Maybe. I would like to wind the clock back a little bit and take another look at this whole story from a completely different angle. Let us begin with another war, an earlier war. That was a war of code-breaking achievement on not quite such a grand scale as World War II, but nevertheless one that was pretty impressive. The Brits would have it that America entered World War I because the Brits had managed to crack something called the Zimmermann telegram, which was a German diplomatic signal trying to coax the Mexicans into the war on the German side, the consequence of which, and here's the devil's pact at work, that if the Mexicans came in on the German side, that when it came to negotiating the peace treaty, various states that had been seized by the United States in the Mexican War of the previous century would be returned to Mexicans' sovereignty. So bye-bye California, Arizona, New Mexico, whatever. You may have your own perspective on why the US came into the First World War, and we don't possibly need to go into that, because the point I'm trying to make is that the Brits crowed about the Zimmermann telegram and their other achievements, in particular breaking German naval codes and therefore winning the war at sea through signals intelligence. And they crowed about it, they talked about it, they gave lectures about it, they caused this article to appear in the Times on the 14th of December 1927. I don't know whether they thought that the Germans didn't read the Times, but the Germans did read the Times, and so Korvettenkapitein Kleikamp wrote a paper on the British code-breaking abilities during World War I. For reasons that are completely unfathomable, I stumbled across Korvettenkapitein Kleikamp's paper in the National Archives Records Administration at College Park, Maryland. So you have to come to the US to read a German interwar document. Don't ask. Don't ask. What he says in this passage, that it's in German Gothic type, and from this angle I can't actually read it, but the gist of it is that it was the game with cards face up on the table. The British knew exactly where the German fleet was and what its intentions were from reading the encrypted German naval signals. The Germans were paying attention. They realised that their communications security had been rubbish during World War I, and therefore they were minded to do something about it. Hence, the machine on the left of the slide, the one that you've all heard of, and the reason why you came to the talk this evening. Meanwhile, my ancestors decided to stick to the old tried and trusted methods of World War I because they knew they worked. Maybe, without actually checking, they knew they worked. So this document on the right-hand side of the slide is a code book from the World War II era, and this shows you how it works. You basically have a dictionary system. At the top of the page, you've got words that they've picked out of the dictionary to form the sentence stragglers from convoy HX 102, steer to pass through position 30 degrees, 200 miles from position Q, blah, blah. Okay, and so you can see each of those words and phrases has got a code sequence attached to it. Now, code's very easy to break because it's quite likely that if you don't know the word stragglers, something from convoy HX 102 has got to do this and that. What's it going to be? I mean, there's probably only half a dozen possibilities, and so it's quite easy for good linguists to piece together the missing things. It's a bit like a crossword puzzle. You can probably guess what they are and see what fits. And so reconstructing code books is actually quite easy. So to make it more difficult, you do false addition. You take a separate sequence from a super-encipherment table, like at the bottom half of this explanation, this example that I've taken from this code book. You add a different 5-digit sequence, but you use non-carrying arithmetic, and if you want me to explain that at the end, then I'm happy to do that. But this means that it disguises the code sequence, and when the recipient gets the message, what they have to do is to strip off, they subtract the 5-digit sequences added on by the code clerk at the sending end, they strip it off, they subtract it at the receiving end, and then you get back to the code numbers, and then you can look them up in a reverse dictionary. So this system is World War I technology, and this is what the Korvettenkapitein Kleikamp was saying. This is the kind of thing that we need to move away from because we can see that it's grossly insecure. This document, that printed document on the slide, is from 1943. It's a British naval, this is how you do it. Oh dear. Oh dear, oh dear. Let me quote to you from Wilhelm Tranow, from the Beobachtungsdienst, which is literally the observation service, but it's the German naval code-breaking section. And he says, before the Spanish War, we had extensively reconstructed the British naval code. Reconstruction of the code was facilitated because the ships also reported all merchant ship movements in the Mediterranean in this code, and we could look up the routes of these merchant ships in Lloyd's Weekly Shipping Report. So in other words, they had a sort of like a buy to the second round of sort of what the code actually meant. This code continued in use well into World War II, even though He's talking about before the Spanish War, so that's before 1936. Oops. Meanwhile, the Brits, well, they're thinking about their need to think about code and cipher security and improve things. So they had a meeting on the 17th of March 1933. And here's what the Admiralty representatives had to say. They did not desire to pursue investigations into machines of the types hitherto considered. What we're talking about there is Enigma machines, because the Brits had gone and bought one on the open market, and they were looking at it to see whether it was a good thing to adopt. And while they kept an open mind on the subject, that's a coded phrase, I'll come back and explain what that means in a minute, they kept an open mind on the subject, they were of the opinion that a re-ciphering machine was the only one that they were likely to find advantageous. Now, a re-ciphering machine, in other words, a machine to mechanize the process that I was describing on the previous slide. So clearly, when they say they're keeping an open mind, they have firmly closed their mind to the idea of innovation. We're going to stick to the tried and trusted methods. Meanwhile, the Germans are not standing still. They, over a period of years, they implement a whole load of technological innovations and improvements to keep the Enigma machine just constantly evolving with the aim of confounding anybody who might be thinking of having a go at it, changing the rotors, changing the plug board arrangement, changing the reflector wheel, changing the arrangements for settings and so forth and so forth. And you can see there's a constant stream of these changes coming through, right through to the fall of France in 1940. And it's a bit more than just technological change. The German army is constantly worried about the security of Enigma, and they commission report after report after report on, these are really quite detailed cryptanalytic reports on how easy it would be, what it would take to master Enigma. And you can see that in 1940 alone, they commissioned 18 studies from their code breakers on this particular question. And that led to what I've called the Feldgiebel order, where it was concluded that the repetition at the beginning of a message of something called the indicator sequence, which basically says what letter should face upwards at the beginning of encryption in your three-rotor Enigma machine. The indicator tells the operator which three letters should be uppermost. They repeated that. And one of these studies has said, don't do that, it's fatal. And so just before invading France in 1940, General Feldgiebel, the head of signals in the German army, said, that practice has got to stop. And this is very important because at that point, the Polish, French, and British code breakers had been reading Enigma messages because of the repeated indicator sequence. So from the moments that the Germans invaded France, they were actually locked out of Enigma messages. Meanwhile, the German Navy has a slightly different approach to things. What they're worried about is less the sort of theoretical breakability of the thing, but the fear of capture. If you're going to send units like submarines into enemy waters, the chances are that a submarine that's before long is going to get captured. So the machine has basically no security in terms of the secrecy of the device. The machine is going to be captured. Then the question is, well, what about the settings of the machine? And what if they get captured as well? Because they're printed in documents. So they went to all sorts of elaborate lengths to try and prevent that from happening, including printing the setup arrangements on pink blotting paper in pink ink, which is barely legible when it's dry, but on contact with seawater, the pink ink floats off, and so you're left with just lots of soggy toilet tissue, which is not really terribly helpful. So they were pretty clever, and they were constantly worrying about whether the system had been broken because they were looking at all these actual events on the ground, or rather at sea, that were causing them to worry about security. So they were investigating and investigating and investigating. So I don't think you can claim that the Germans were being negligent about the security, whether they were army or navy people. From different perspectives, they were working pretty hard to keep an eye on their communications security. So let me do you a situation report just at the moment that America wakes up that there's something called World War II going on and finds it unavoidable that it can has to get involved. I would say that at this point, Germany has got world-class encipherment technology. I don't think anybody, possibly you might say that the Japanese, but possibly apart from that example, I think that Germany leads the world in the sophistication of its encipherment machinery. What's more, Germany's naval codebreakers have mastered the British naval codes. And the British are still using World War I technology, which they ought to realise is highly vulnerable. And at this point, the British are woefully unaware of the German successes against their codes and ciphers. At this point, it looks like Britain is going to lose the war, but for the fact that the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Thank God. You know, you never expected somebody to stand in this room and say, thank God the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Well, it's not that bad, really, because the British had developed the famous Turing Welshman bomb, the machine that actually figured out for them how the Enigma machine was being set up on a daily basis. And that's in operation, and there are enough of them to start making a difference by 1941. But not all German Enigma systems are readable through bomb attack. And I think it's worth just sort of doing a balance sheet for this, because we tend to think that once you've got the bomb, you know, it's the Benedict Cumberbatch we all live happily ever after kind of thing. It wasn't really quite like that. So yes, from quite early on in the war, 1940 onwards, we had been able to read German Air Force traffic, and that was very helpful, and that gave us lots of insights into all sorts of things. So that's, you know, not just Air Force things, so that's very good. But German Army, we couldn't read German Army stuff until well into 1942. And so you can see from that it's the spring and summer of 1942 that we actually start getting into German Army traffic. U-boat Enigma, we'd had some success in 1941, but by 1942, and I'll explain this in a second, we were locked out. We had quite a good deal of success with Italian ciphers, Enigma, of course, which was very helpful in the Mediterranean, but most importantly, their version of the haggling machine, which was called the C-38M, which we'd managed to crack, and that told us an awful lot about Rommel's convoys across the Mediterranean. So there was lots going on the cryptanalytic front, which meant that Britain was actually clawing its way back into the fight. But that's the cryptanalytic front, not the security front. So, again, while I carry on this sort of appreciation, I look at it from the German perspective. Admiral Dönitz is very upset at this point, and this is the sort of turn of the year 41, 42. He's very upset because he's thinking that something is amiss because the British have been reading U-boat Enigma during 1941. He has found that his U-boats can't find the convoys anymore. They're not where they're supposed to be. And so he is very bothered about this and thinks that there may be a problem with his communications. In other words, he suspects that the Enigma has been cracked. And then this is quite interesting. This is a post-war appreciation written by a US naval officer, Lieutenant Commander McMahon. And he says, in effect, the solution to the problem, the one I just described, which characterized 1941, the problem of finding convoys, came with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, because the opportunity for attacking independent shipping presented itself in American coastal waters. So the U-boat successes started to rise, not because the communication security had improved, but because there was just a lot more targets now, particularly, and there's a very famous set of discussions about the lack of security and lack of convoying down the eastern seaboard of the USA, and how the U-boats were able to pick off the merchant ships because they were outlined against the coastal lights of the towns and cities all the way up the Atlantic coast. However, the most important thing from Dernitz's perspective was that that time, the beginning of 1942, marked the rollout of a more secure version of Enigma, the 4-rotor version, which was not capable of being attacked using the 3-rotor bomb technology developed by Bletchley Park. So in other words, Pearl Harbor and the 4-rotor bomb mean that not only are there more targets for U-boats, but it also means that the availability of technology to route convoys away from U-boats has suddenly been lost. 1942 is looking like a bad year. We'll look at the shipping losses in a second. I also want to mention one other thing. We've focused quite a lot in this talk on the naval codes, but the British Army codes were just as bad. And this little report on the left-hand side, which dates from November 1942, but it's a retrospective, and it says that the War Office Code, which is the code that was being used by the British War Office to send instructions to generals in the field, that is, in the field in North Africa, was completely legible by the Germans because it was the same old. We have a dictionary code book and we super encipher it with our 5-digit sequences. And this is something that the German army codebreakers can easily take in their stride. Okay. So, at this point, they can read ours. We basically can't read theirs, with the exception of the Luftwaffe stuff. But for now, we have got some Enigma breaking technology, but on the other hand, they are doing security investigations. So really the question is, which side is going to wake up and smell the coffee? Who's going to figure out that the other side is reading their stuff? Both lots are doing it at the same time. It's a race. I would like to introduce you to one of the heroes of World War II that nobody has ever heard of. He is a naval officer, even if he doesn't particularly look the part, and those naval officers in the audience will recognise somebody who's a paymaster commander, and they'll say, well, that's not proper Navy, that's sort of like, that's the accounting branch, that's the bean counter department. They have to wear special flashes on their sleeves, so they're not proper sailors at all. Okay, Lieutenant Commander Russell Dudley Smith is one of my heroes. He is a regular naval officer, though, yes, he was in the paymaster branch. He arrived at Bletchley Park in April of 1941. He became the founder of a unit called the Security of Allied Communications, because what he did when he was at sea in the mid-1930s was he had a go at breaking British naval codes. He was bored. He'd finished counting the oranges, ordering the booze, working out how many, whatever it is, yards of rope or whatever it is they needed to add to the soil. Actually, it's pots of paint. That's what you do in the Navy, isn't it? You paint stuff manically. So how many pots of paint they needed to take on board at Alexandria. He got bored with all that stuff, so he started breaking his own side's codes. Nearly got fired, of course, but it is the route to Bletchley Park when you do that kind of thing. And here he is at work at Bletchley Park in November of 1941, a month before Pearl Harbor. And he reads an Enigma signal, which was sent to the Beobachtungsdienst, the German code-breaking service. And what he reads in this Enigma signal is that, quote, "The wireless telegraphy traffic between USA stations and merchant ships is in 5-letter groups, partially readable cipher, designation Hansa cipher number 1, original designation CSP938. Cipher consists of a reciprocal bigram table." Interesting. Dudley starts looking at the signals that are going in Hansa cipher number 1 without knowing what the code is. And he reconstructs it. These are his working papers from the UK National Archives. He's actually reconstructed it, and you can see he's reconstructed a message on the right-hand side, and his description was that it was pathetically simple. It's not just the Brits who are using lousy communications security. It's all right, doesn't keep the information to himself. He phones up, or rather causes a telegram to be sent to OP-20G, which you will all know is the US Navy's code-breaking unit. OP-20G says, well. I mean, of course they would say that. It was the Brits telling them what to think. So they said, well, the Germans must have pinched it. Not helpful. You should be actually looking at your own security rather than saying, well, because the Brits told you. Oh dear. So that bit didn't work in terms of waking up and smelling the coffee. Another thing, look at the little note in the middle. You can't read that handwriting because that's the handwriting of the head of MI6. And it's a secret. You can tell it's the head of MI6 because it's in green ink. And only the head of MI6 can sign memos in green ink. That is one of the weird things about being British. Okay, what C, who doesn't have a name because he's the head of MI6, says is Commander Travis. He's writing to the new head of Bletchley Park. Commander Travis, disturbing, to put it mildly. A very useful compilation. What's he on about? Well, Dudley has written a memo. The problem is that there was a chap called F.L. Lucas who wrote a memo in 1941 saying British codes and ciphers are lousy, and the reason I can tell you that is because there are indications in deciphered German messages that pass my desk which show that they're reading our stuff. Nobody did anything about it. So Dudley has had another go in 1942, and this report actually has reached C's desk, and he is disturbed by it, to put it mildly. Well, of course, he's reacted in an appropriate civil service manner by putting a little note on it saying he's finding it disturbing, and then he's put it in the out basket. That's what you do, isn't it? So in other words, nothing has happened. Then there is a cascade of unignorables. First of all, this little signals unit on the right-hand side, the left-hand side of the slide, is captured in North Africa, a unit called NFAK 621. This is Rommel's really high-class battlefield signals intelligence unit. They do on-the-spot decryption. These guys go into battle armed with typewriters and radio direction finding systems and pieces of squared paper and sharp pencils. When they're attacked by the Australians not far from El Alamein, they don't have a lot to defend themselves with. They had a couple of rifles and that was it. And they managed to put up a fight for an hour and a half, which I think is pretty impressive given the rubbish weaponry that they had. But of course they got captured, and meanwhile, half of the guys who do not have rifles are sort of shoveling documents into braziers and trying to get rid of the stuff because they know that the inevitable is going to happen. I quite like the little insignia on their armoured vehicle, which has got a picture of Africa with a sort of radio zap across it, which shows you what they do. Of course, we captured vast amounts of paperwork from these guys, which showed exactly what they had been reading and for how long, and how rubbish our codes and ciphers were in the field. Oh dear. That is pretty unignorable. Meanwhile, what's going on the naval front is a hard load of work by Dudley and his team to try and find what they call the smoking gun, which was the naval Enigma message, which would say verbatim. It would be a verbatim quote from a British naval message. And this is really hard to do, because if you think about it, I'm looking at English translations of German signals which have been encrypted in Enigma. And I'm looking for a word-for-word copy out of a British coded message that's come from a dictionary code. So a dictionary code might have a word in it like ship, which will get coded as 36063. But 36063 could be a naval unit, and any number of synonyms could be used. So a word-for-word verbatim copy out, by the time it's been through the mill of translation into German, enigmarified, de-enigmarified by the Bletchley Park codebreakers, and then rendered back into English, it's pretty remarkable if you actually come across a verbatim copy out, but they found one. And you'll see that it's mentioned in this signal. It's a mea culpa confessional by Travis to his opposite number in the Navy Department. Personal for Redmond, I think it says, from Travis. We've now got definite evidence that this code that we're using, the general deciphering table, has been compromised. And then Travis says the most weird thing, bearing in mind that this is a radio signal that's being sent from Bletchley Park to Washington. It's being sent by radio. It's not being sent in plain language. It's being sent in something called a cipher. And Travis says, please back up this more frequent, I can't read that, change, if possible, without giving any, I'm sorry, I'm struggling to read it from this angle, without giving any source, and no suggestion that number 3 has been compromised should be made in any document or signal. Like this one, for example. He doesn't get it yet, does he? But okay, there is at least the beginning of a sort of an aroma, a faint aroma of coffee is there in the air at Bletchley Park. All right. What's happening on the other side? Any coffee brewing in Berlin? Not in the Kriegsmarine. Let me introduce you to some of the key characters on the German side. On the army side, we've got General Feldgiebel, who we met before. His code-breaking team included, amongst other things, a mathematics teacher called Dr. Otto Bugisch. He's the gentleman to Feldgiebel's right. I'm going to mention Bugisch again later on, but Bugisch was pretty good at breaking cipher machines, which for a maths teacher I think is pretty impressive. And the other guy in the army box is Fritz Menzer. He's an engineer, and we'll come across him on the next slide. Essentially what's going on in the army, they're doing all these reports and investigations into the theoretical breakability of Enigma, and they conclude that Enigma is theoretically breakable. But when they look at the British Army signals that they can read, there is nothing that appears in them to indicate that the Brits have actually mastered Enigma. But bear in mind what I said a couple of slides ago, by the midway through 1942, that's absolutely right. The Brits had not mastered German Army Enigma. So it's not surprising they didn't come across any evidence. So we think we've got a weak system, but we think we're okay at the minute. I think I'm going to give them 9.5 out of 10 for that, because it's probably true. They've got the right idea, and they're okay for the time being. Good. Navy. Admiral Dönitz, top left, constantly stressing about where the convoys are and why his U-boats aren't having better success, thinks it's down to communications insecurity, and he is less well served by his team. On his right is Wilhelm Tranow, who we've met before, German Navy's ace codebreaker. He is not let in on the worries. He's not invited to share his expertise on the problem. He's not asked what he thinks about Enigma. His focus has got to be on breaking the British and now American naval codes. And so they didn't even think of asking him to participate in the debate on communications security from the German side. Interesting. They leave that to the gentleman on the bottom right-hand side. His name is Admiral Erhard Mertens. He is the head of the Marine Intelligence Department. And we'll see what he thinks about it in a second. But basically, the philosophy going on the German naval side is there's lots of suspicious incidents, particularly this U-boat problem. But there is no theory to support the idea that Enigma has been compromised. It's a mirror image of what we can see on the German army side. So, where does this lead to? It leads on the German army side. They decide they're going to scrap Enigma and they're going to replace it with a new device invented by Fritz Menzer. It's something called the SG-41, which stands for Schlüsselgerät 41. Very imaginative. It means cipher device 1941. Okay. Have you got an example in your museum? You've got an example in your museum, haven't you? You've got a photo. That's your photo. But okay, so there might be an example of Fritz Menzer's SG-41 in the National Cryptologic Museum at Fort Meade, Maryland. Anyway, go there and find out whether I'm right. There we go. German Navy. Okay. Dönitz becomes head of the German Navy in early 1943. In fact, to be exact, on Saturday, the 30th of January, 1943. And his first act on taking office is to commission a root and branch study of the security of German naval communications. He has not believed any of the BS that he has been fed as head of the U-boat service over the last 3 years. I encourage you to look at the date of this document. If you cannot read it, it says 3/2/1943, bearing in mind that it's a European dating system, so that means it's the 3rd of February 1943. How many days after Dönitz took office? And they're already producing this report. This report is enormous, by the way. I mean, it's hundreds of pages. It's hundreds of pages. It is not humanly imaginable that Mertens did not have this on his desk already. And now you have to look at the headline, which says, in these spaced out letters, Der Feind liest mit, exclamation mark, question mark, exclamation mark, which means the enemy is co-reading. You what? Every single sub-report in this huge report is headed Der Feind liest mit, exclamation mark, question mark, exclamation mark. I mean, it is the most dismissive thing, and it's totally defensive. It doesn't look at the evidence properly. It just says it can't possibly happen. Stop troubling us with this obsession of yours, Dönitz. You may be our boss, but you are still wrong. It's very interesting. It may have been wrong at one point, but it had been right at one point, and it might be right again. Let's do an Allied update. Autumn 1943. The Allies have basically turned the corner on the German U-boat Enigma. The new US naval bomb, the four-rotor machine designed by Joe Desch in Dayton, Ohio, is being rolled out and operating here in Washington. That is finding the settings on the U-boat Enigma, and therefore we now know where the U-boats are going to be and can start routing the convoys around them again. That's great. Better still, because of the smoking gun message, the Brits have actually modified the old World War I coding system. Instead of just reading out the super-encipherment sequences from the tables, they put a stencil over it. And I think this one is in your museum, isn't it? This is a stencil subtractor. Well, again, the photo comes from your collection. So the idea is you put a stencil over the table of numbers, and then you read out the numbers that appear in the little windows, and then you can change the stencil. You can turn it upside down, you can turn it round, you can flip it over. So you've got lots of different ways of reusing the same numbers, but with a different result every time. So you can use the same old code books, but confuse the enemy. And this was complicated and difficult enough to basically give a year and a half, maybe 2 years of extra security, keeping Tranoff and his team puzzled for the time being. So here's the result. I promised you some merchant shipping losses. So this is tonnage of merchant ships lost to U-boats for each 3-month period of World War II. If you look at the periods where Bletchley Park and Op 20G are able to read the naval Enigma, you can see that it's having a very significant effect on merchant shipping losses. So, all right, this is the time to cue the music and we can go home and we all live happily ever after. Maybe. Let's have another look at the merchant shipping losses chart. I'm now looking at it from the German side. The shaded parts are where Tranoff and his team are reading naval cipher. Look, when they can read it thoroughly, the merchant shipping losses soar. When they can read it a bit, they are not quite as devastating, but they're still significant. It's only when they're locked out completely, with the stencil subtractor coming in force, that the merchant shipping losses tail off. It's so odd. It's identical chart, and I just find that quite remarkable. Okay. The other reason why we shouldn't perhaps sort of go cozily to our beds just yet is that the German army and the German navy haven't given up the struggle just yet. The German army are still commissioning studies into Enigma. As we know, they've got this plan to roll out Mensa's new machine, and there are all these technological add-ons to the Enigma machine which are cheaper and easier to introduce than scrapping the technology. Can you imagine how many Enigma machines there are out there in the field? If you replace them all with Mensa's machine, it's new procedures, it's new technology, it's a drain on resources, you know, it's a nightmare. So actually what they decided to do is to do these things where you've got the variable notch rotor, this thing which is called the Lückenfüller Walzer, this thing on the bottom left. They put this Enigma Uhr thing in, which is the little dial device that you use to change the plug board settings from one message to another. It's a very clever thing. That was an absolute killer, actually, potentially, if I used it right. They put in a reflector that you can actually wire up the wiring on it so that you can change it from one day to the next or in one message to the next if you wanted to. We roll out all these things. The one that would actually have really knocked everyone out was the Lückenfüller Walzer, but that didn't come in until very late in the war. They're not sitting on their backsides complacently, is my message. Meanwhile, in the Navy, Dönitz is still, he sacks Mertens after a bit. He gets fed up with him. And he puts another guy in who's much more sensible called Stummel. He appoints a guy called Heinz Bonartz as Tranoff's boss, Tranoff being a civilian, Bonart's being a naval officer, Bonart's immediate reaction is, we have a problem. And they have a problem because of the milch cows. I'm going to talk to you about the milch cows in a minute. Okay. And eventually, with this new team, they decide that wouldn't it be a good idea to get one of Tranoff's team to come in and actually look at the security of Enigma from a theoretical perspective. Let's work out if there's some technological way that the Allies could actually possibly be breaking it. So they appoint a guy called Hans-Joachim Frovine to investigate the possibility of breaking Enigma using punch card technology, and he reports that it can be done. His report isn't delivered until the autumn of 1944, by which time Germany has lost the war. They didn't sit still. Dönitz was ill-served by his first team of supporters. Okay, I want to just do 2 case studies and then we'll wrap up. This is last stages. First of all, the last stages of the war in Europe. The Battle of the Bulge. Oh dear. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. The American servicemen were using a haggling device called the M209. Otto Bugish, my maths teacher, who I introduced you to a few moments ago, had cracked the American M209 system with 140,000 of these machines in service across the world, but quite a lot of them in the war in Europe. The Germans knew exactly what the American battlefield intelligence was. And here's the story. When it comes to the Battle of the Bulge, when, as we know, the attack from the east by the German tanks took everybody by surprise during the Christmas holidays of 1944, the wash-up report is not very nice reading. Ever since D-Day, US signals have been of great insistence to the enemy. Scores of instances, blah, blah, blah. Out of 30-odd US divisions in the West, the Germans have constantly known the location and often the intentions of all but 2 or 3. And then the last paragraph I've highlighted there. It is, in short, a little startling to find the Germans had a better knowledge of US order of battle from their signals intelligence than we had of German order of battle from source. Source with a capital S, meaning Enigma. That's right at the end of the war. You don't want to be reading stuff like that. I promised to talk to you about milch cows. Okay, what's a milch cow? Okay, a milch cow is an extremely fat U-boat. And it's a U-boat with no weaponry. It may have an anti-aircraft gun, but otherwise it is unarmed. And what a milch cow does is it's basically a submersible tanker that takes fuel principally, but other resupply possibilities to attack U-boats in mid-ocean. So here's the theory. It's a great idea. My name is Admiral Ernest J. King, and I think what we should do is attack the bleep, 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 bleep out of the milch cows. Because if we eliminate the milch cow fleet, then the U-boats cannot refuel, and their radius of operation will be confined to a place where we have air superiority and they will be wiped out. We will have won the Battle of the Atlantic, period. This is where Bonart's is getting very upset, because he realizes that every time they send out a milch cow and they signal to the U-boats where the rendezvous is for refueling operations, some wretched US aircraft show up from some carrier that's in the vicinity, and we even have photographs. I mean, we actually have photographs of a refueling operation going on, and this is clearly it's an aerial photograph taken by an attacking US fighter plane, which is, as you can see, bombing the bleep, 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 as per Admiral King's orders, out of the milch cow, which I think is probably the one on the right. The one on the left looks like a slender creature, so I assume that's an attack U-boat. I could tell you, the photos in the book, and you can read which boats they are in that question. Okay, so the US and the UK both had submarine tracking rooms, and they spoke to each other. Commander Wynne, top left for the Brits, and Commander Knowles for the Americans, and they exchanged intelligence and bad jokes from time to time, and Wynne's reaction to the attacks on the milch cows was that it was too true to be good, which Knowles thought was quite entertaining. And why was it too true to be good? There's a nice signal here sent by, I think it's probably sent by King to the British Admiralty. And basically it says, and again, I'm not going to try and read it out because at this angle it's not going to go well, but basically it says that the Germans have recognised that we're attacking the milch cow rendezvous, and they have changed their signalling system, which is the thing that Wynne was worried about. He said, if they realise what we're up to, they're not stupid. They'll realise instantly that we're onto their signals. And King basically said, yep, that's fine, we'll take the risk. And Wynne was right, the Germans changed the system, but King was right too, because he'd managed, there weren't enough milch cows, and so he'd eliminated 100% of the milch cow fleet, and therefore had won the Battle of the Atlantic with what was a gamble. It was one hell of a gamble. In fact, just on that note, if you just look back at everything I've been talking to you about for the last 50 minutes or so, I think the whole thing was one hell of a gamble. So I think Wellington probably got it right. It was the nearest run thing you ever saw. All right, that brings me to the end. Amanda is pointing the way for those of you who want to ask questions. In fact, it appears that anybody who has a question will be put up in lights. So
they'll be included on the YouTube video after the fact. This question might come as a shock to you, but someone asked me to ask you about the connection between this room and this book.
Well, thank you for asking that. So when I was doing the research for this book, much of the material, as you have detected, is based here in the US, particularly in the archives at College Park. So I was over here on a research visit, and Amanda put a usual strong-arm sort of tactics and got me into this room and made me give a talk. But while I was here, she said, have you read the Washington Post? And I said, no. So why would I read the Washington Post? So she says, you've got to read the Washington Post. So I said, okay. Right. And so on page, 15, there's this huge article in the Washington Post on the day that I'm here. And it's about the lack of security of an Enigma derivative, a machine manufactured by a Swiss company called Crypto-Argay, which was essentially a new generation Enigma derivative. And it was all about how that machine had been rigged so that the certain intelligence services, and I would not exclude the CIA or the BND, the German intelligence services, and possibly some others as well, were given a sort of an easy route to decrypting any signals that happened to have been encrypted on this machine. And this was kind of a bit of a revelation, but it was very nice because it provided a bookend to my story. So thank you, first of all, for inviting me. Secondly, thank you very much for waving the Washington Post under my nose and telling me I needed to read this thing because it was important. It was absolutely important because the whole Enigma story is full of these betrayals and oddities, the people doing things that they perhaps shouldn't have been doing, and so there's you can take it on the communications security level story at one level, but there's this whole undercurrent of sort of the whole Enigma story is sort of, it's riddled with woodworm and holes the whole way through it. So it's really, I mean, the whole thing is very interesting, and it just finishes up with this crypto-argay piece of rot right at the end. Very interesting. Thank you.
Well, and I do have one, and I want folks from the audience to ask a question. I do have one from online. If you wanted to know if a relative of yours had worked at Bletchley Park, would there be a way to find out?
Yes and no. There is a very, very useful online directory available at Bletchley Park where you can look up the names of all the people who are known by the Bletchley Park research historians to have worked there. So just go visit the Bletchley Park website, and there's a page, Find a Veteran, and you can just type in their name. Why? So that sounds like it's a yes, but it's also a no, because the way that register has been built up is typically because people come on and actually do the opposite thing from what you've just described. What they do is they'll come along and say, hey, did you know my auntie worked at Bletchley Park? And at which point the Bletchley Park people will say, hey, that's fantastic, we'd love to know a bit more. And then they'll put her on the put auntie on the register. So what I've discovered quite recently, actually, just in January of this year, I found an entire set of personnel records from Hut 8 at Bletchley Park, where they listed the new arrivals into Hut 8 and the departures from Hut 8 over a 8-9 month period. And I couldn't find a single one of those people in the Find a Veterans thing. Even they got thousands and thousands of names there. So, because I thought, oh, this is really interesting. I'd like to know who these people are. I know I'll go straight to the Find a Veteran page on the Bletchley Park website. And not a single one of them there, which I find remarkable. So it tells you there are big holes in the record that they do have. So, frankly, if your auntie did work at Bletchley Park, or your great aunt or your grandmother or whoever it is, please do tell them. They would love to hear from you.
Dermot, perhaps you have stunned everyone into submission.
Well, I know. I've been going an hour now, and they're thinking it's dinner time, or oh, there's football on, or something.
Well, this has been absolutely terrific, and I know you're going to be sticking around. For those of us who are here live at the Spy Museum, he will be signing his books, which will be available for sale out in the hallway behind us. They're also available online for our folks watching from home, and this will be up on our YouTube channel soon if you'd like to watch it again or share it with friends. So thank you very much, Dermot Turing.
Thank you.